Hello. Like many of you, I am sure that you work remotely, as I do. It's one of the great things about working in tech, right? We get to work from anywhere. And about a month after I started with my current company, I got the chance to actually meet with my colleagues for a conference because, of course. And during that time, we got to know each other better personally, professionally, and we also talked quite a bit about like some topics that are of interest to us. And one of my colleagues talked about micro frontends pretty briefly. And I remember thinking like, was I supposed to know what that is? I'm a front end developer, but I've not heard of that. And so what I did was, I went to Google, like most people do, looked it up. And as I started to read about it and learn more, well, I had a lot of questions. Like, for example, how is it spelled? Like, we've got this hyphen in between, without the hyphen, one word. Like, we really just need to come to an agreement. I really hope that happens soon. But, in addition to that question, there were so many more. And so, however, I think what's really important is that for any team, before they decide to use a micro frontend, is to really just think about some questions. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit here today. And so hopefully after this, you and your team will be able to decide whether to micro frontend or not to micro frontend. But first, just a little bit about me. My name is Danielle Maxwell, and I'm a junior distributed systems engineer at Rotational Labs. And so I work with React on the front end, I work with Go on the back end. So I guess that makes me a full stack developer. And then just a fun fact about me, I am a really big fan of the team called Liverpool FC. If any soccer, football fans here, you may know, yes, great. However, we don't talk about this season. No, we do not need to talk about this season ever again. Okay, and so those are just a few facts about me. And because I know she's probably watching, I just want to say, hey, mom. All right. So, micro frontends. So what is a micro frontend? It's an architecture style. And what you do is that you will break front-end code up into smaller parts. So instead of it being in a monorepo, you will have multiple repositories for your apps. Each front end is then integrated in the browser to provide a uniform user experience. So when the user goes onto your website, they don't have a clue that they're actually looking at apps that are all created separately by separate teams. And a couple of examples of companies that use micro frontends are Capital One and IKEA, or I read that IKEA does. However, I couldn't find anything more updated than like maybe a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. So hopefully IKEA actually still uses this. And a thing I want to note is that like this approach kind of came out of the microservices architecture. Many people thought, well, have the services that are broken up. Why aren't we doing the same thing for the front end? And as you can see here, just like a visual example, with the monolith, kind of start from the bottom up at Rotational Labs. We use Go for our backend. So, that's our service layer. Then in the middle, we have a REST API. And then we have our React app, for example. We even have for like one of our clients, we have 3 separate React apps inside of one repository. However, as you can see with the micro frontend, something that you can do is actually break this up into multiple parts. So for example, I decided to say, hey, let's like kind of break this up by feature. So I forgot to update billing at the bottom. But if you see payments, it means billing payments. It's the same. But so we have a Teams feature, for example, and it would be, have a Teams microservice for example, have billing, payments, and then we could also have like a projects feature. And again, they each have kind of like a separate microservice that works for them. And so now let's talk a little bit about the pros and the cons of a micro frontend. So incremental updates. Because if you have a smaller app, it's going to be much easier for your team to be able to make updates. If you discover that your users prefer something more, even if it's an internal tool, because I remember that Capital One kind of has like a lot of internal tools for their micro front ends. And they mentioned that, a lot of their employees said, hey, can you do this? Can you do that? So whether it's internal or external customers, when you use this, it's much easier to be able to make updates that will make your users much, much happier. Also can reduce deployment bottlenecks because, again, if you have smaller apps, it's going to be much easier for you to deploy. You don't have to really wait on other teams in order to be able to make your updates and ship them. And then you're going to have a much smaller code base. Now, it's kind of hard for me to really say, like, how many lines of code are really too many lines of code. Only you and your team can really decide that. However, I'm sure we all have seen an app that, as it continues to grow, as your team grows, it just gets bigger and bigger. You have more components. You start to see more lines of code, start to see more files. And sometimes it just becomes really difficult to find sometimes even the simplest things within the repository. Now a con as well is complex. And as I talk a little bit more, you'll kind of get an idea of what I mean by it's complex. But the traditional way, most of us, we just kind of we use Vue or Next.js, and we start up our React app. We start, putting our components together, and then we ship. It's good to go. However, with the micro front-end approach, you have to kind of think about a little bit more. Also, you can have like duplicated code and dependencies. If you have, like in my example, there were three apps. And so there's a great chance that those three apps are going to use very similar dependencies. And then a large build size, because if you have 3 apps, 4 apps, 5, and they all have their own dependencies, then they're all going to have their own individual build size. And that's just going to continue to increase exponentially. Again, it's kind of hard to say like, well, you want to keep your build size under this amount. But one thing we want to do is always think about our users. And of course, the larger the build size, then the slower the performance. And that's something we definitely don't want. Okay, so I'm going to talk about integrating your apps. But before I get to that, let's just assume that your team has decided, yes, we want to go with the micro front-end approach. You've decided that you know exactly how you want to divide up your code. For example, like the features that I showed, or, if you have additional features that you want to divide them up into. So you said you had your meetings, you said, okay, this is how we're going to have everything divided up going forward. But now, how do you integrate them? So question number 1 is, which integration method will you use? We have build time integration, runtime integration. And with runtime integration, you can have like the server side. And so that, if you choose this option, then the backend would determine exactly which micro front end would be loaded. You can also use edge side. And with this here, you would actually have a CDN that makes this decision. And then you have client side. And with the client side, you're likely going to have like a container or a host app that is also deployed separately. And I'm going to focus more on the client side because, well, we're at a React conference. So here, teams, payments, projects, we have our 3 separate apps, have their 3 separate repositories. And so just on top of this now, to connect these 3 will be a container app. And what that does is it will communicate with each app, determines when exactly to show them based on, of course, when the user is actually on your website and is navigating your site. And then you can also actually use it to display like shared UI elements so that you don't have to have a header in each app, for example, or a footer in each app. So with build time integration, a team will create a micro front-end app, but then they will publish it like a package, publish it as a package. And so with the container app, it will then be installed as a dependency. We all have done this several times, our npm or npm install, yarn add. We're all quite used to this. The container will have to be deployed, however, anytime there is a change to one of the apps that has been installed. And in a way that kind of defeats the purpose of having a micro front end, right? Because the great thing about this approach is that each team is working separately and they don't have to depend on each other in order to deploy their changes and to make updates. However, this is really easy to set up. And so, although it's not quite ideal, if you're experimenting, if your team is experimenting, really trying to decide if this is what they want to do, or if your team is, trying to get something together pretty quickly, then taking this build time approach might be the best way to go. And then going forward, you can kind of get together again, revisit it, and decide, hey, do we want to keep continue to work with the micro front end approach, and then decide if you want to move to another integration option. With runtime integration, each app is deployed separately, has its own URL, and then the container app will then fetch each app once it is loaded to the browser. However, with this approach, it is much more difficult to set up in comparison to build time. Because with build time, you're just installing a package, deploying, and then you're good to go. With runtime, you have to actually, configure the apps in a way so that the container is actually able to pull in the separate apps, the separate micro front-end apps. In addition, we have some options for this client-side runtime integration approach. One is module federation, which I'll talk a little bit more about. You also have the option to use import map. You can also use iframes. I know that this is kind of one of those things where you hear iframes and you're like, really? You really want to use an iframe for this? However, this has actually been an approach that several companies have used over time. And so I think one thing that makes it kind of beneficial is the fact that a lot of other devs have experience with using iframes. And it might be much easier for you to actually find more information of how to actually integrate with this approach. And then also you could use web components. Haven't read as much about teams using web components, but this also is an option that you could use with React in order to integrate your apps. Okay, so now, module federation. Has anyone here heard of module federation or used it? Okay, cool. Okay, so next question is, should you use module federation? Well, module federation is a plugin that was included in Webpack 5 and released in 2020. With this plugin, it essentially can load external modules and libraries, and it can also import and export micro front-end apps. That actually makes sharing dependencies much easier, and it makes sharing the apps, like the container fetching the apps, significantly easier. Another great thing about module federation is that, because one of the downsides I mentioned was the fact that you can have duplicate dependencies. So one thing that module federation can do is that it can look at the versions of the dependencies that are installed in each app, and it can determine if they are compatible, and it will use the highest version available if they are compatible. However, if the dependencies are not compatible, then each one will load. So then here's just an example of using module federation. Have a Webpack config file. You would declare just the module federation plugin, have this module exports. Here I have development, but of course you can have production as your mode. You set a port for it. And then here I'm using I'm naming one of the micro front-end apps payments. And then you can see here with shared, I'm just making a note of like some shared dependencies, for example. And then within the container app, again, here we have development, we have the port that is declared, and then we also say like this is the container. And you can see the container is pulling in the individual apps like teams, payments, projects, and the specific file for each one. However, there's a great chance you may not want to use Webpack, you know, like depending on your experience with it, or just the fact that you just don't want to have like this modular federation option. Maybe you want to use something that's a bit more native. And if that is the case, then you can use import map. And as you can see here, we just declare like a script, make the type import map. And then with the imports here, you would again just kind of like declare the name, have the link to the particular apps here, their URL. And then you could pull in the dependencies, like in this case, we're here with React, and then you just close your script. Oh, sorry, go back. Well, before I get to that next part. And so when you have the modular federation, like I said, you have to use Webpack. But with import map, you don't have to use Webpack. However, one of the things about import maps is that they, I believe it was like late last year, or maybe earlier this year, it finally kind of became majorly supported in all of the major browsers. And so with older browsers, you would have to use a polyfill. So that's just something to keep in mind. Although both options are still quite relatively new, so who knows? Someone else may come up with something that's better than import map and modular federation. Okay, so next, how will your apps communicate with each other? Now, if you go online and if you ask, people are going to say, don't share state between your micro front ends. And that makes sense. You know, you have divided up your apps so that you have different features, different services. And so they really shouldn't need to communicate, right? But I mean, come on, let's be real. There's probably a good chance you might have to have some communication between your apps, right? And one idea that comes to mind immediately is authentication. If a user goes into your website that is using a micro front end, if they authenticate in one place, you do not want them to have to authenticate every time they navigate to a separate app. Because again, they don't know that it's a separate app, and we don't want them to know that these are separate apps. So there are many ways in which you can, have your apps communicate. Events is definitely a great way. You can use custom event in the browser. However, I think it would be really great to have like your own custom event bus. The thing that makes this really great is that your apps don't need to know exactly where the event message is coming from. As you can see here, we have like one app that is a publisher. And when you can create a topic, maybe the topic is, we'll say payments, payment received. Every time a payment is received, that micro app could then send a message to the other apps to let them know, like, hey, payment is received. And it would be like the same approach with authentication. Once someone is authenticated, could send that message saying, hey, this has been done, and then the other apps would know. But it wouldn't need to know that it came from the container app or the payments app or the Teams one. And so I think this is something that's really great and can make communicating with your micro front ends much, much simpler. And there's a chance that you're probably thinking like events, like on the front end, like you really want me to use pub sub? But hey, I think it will become much, much easier to actually work with that. Okay, now we have to think about consistency. You have multiple apps, different teams. And one of the great things about having different teams is that they can choose their own stack. I've been talking about having different React apps, and that's great. That's what we want, honestly. But it is possible that someone could say, hey, we want to use Angular. We want to use Angular with React. And it's like, okay, Is it possible? Yes. Should you do it? I don't know. But with the micro front-end approach, that could be possible. But you have to think about the consistency of your apps, because user experience is what we really care the most about. And so, how will you make sure that your apps look consistent? First of all, we have to think about what can cause consistency issues. No single design system. So if you have multiple teams and each team has its own like design team, and then they have their own design system, then there are going to be clashes because there's no consistency there. And so when team one deploys their changes and team two deploys their changes, when you go look at the actual site altogether, there's a chance that, you know, the coloring is going to be different, the buttons might look a little different, the components could look a little different, and it's just not something that you want to see. And so you have to really think about, like, should you have one team that does the design system? And if so, then that's probably like a bit of a trade-off, right? Because here at this point, you're sharing one single design system across multiple teams, potentially. So instead, no single design system, different component libraries. One team is using Material UI, another team is using Chakra. Like, you know, it could be, again, a bit of an issue. And so you have to, again, decide here, are you going to use the same component library? Are you going to create your own component library if you haven't done that already? Exactly what will you do to ensure that the components are looking consistent across each app and for each team? And then CSS conflicts, because of course that will definitely happen. And there are different reasons why CSS conflicts could happen. You know, teams could use different CSS libraries. Maybe one team uses like a CSS and JS option. Another team uses handwritten CSS, although I don't think that really happens much anymore, right? But hey, it could happen. And so when the sites are deployed, if your teams aren't actually like, you know, doing a really great job of like, you know, scoping out the class names for each app, if they're not, you know, really thinking about like what can happen once it's deployed and all of these apps are together and how they can cause issues, then, you know, a user can go into your site, go to register, for example, click the registration button, and then the top of the page could have, I don't know, like a header with maybe like a blue background. Then once they complete the registration, they get redirected back to kind of like a home page. If that registration page maybe had like a different background that was like a light green, when they go back to the home page, then they're going to see this light green color, and it's like, wait, what just happened? And although that's just a very minor example, that is something that could still just make a user go, wait, am I still on the same site? Like, what just happened? So you really have to think about like exactly how much should you share in this case in terms of like ensuring that your apps look consistent. Okay, just to recap. Question number one, which integration method will you use? Will it be build time or runtime? Number two, should you use module federation? You know, as I mentioned, import map is another option. You can use iframes, or you can even use web components. How will your apps communicate with each other? Because it's going to happen. You know, we want to keep that to a minimum, but they will need to talk to each other maybe every now and then. And number four, how will you make sure that your apps look consistent? Now, that's only 4 questions. And the last one, will a micro front end solve your team's problem? Because I think it's really easy to say, hey, you know, our code base is getting huge. We have multiple apps in one repository. We have multiple teams that are working on multiple apps within one repository. But is that really going to solve your problem? You really have to think about exactly what are you trying to resolve, and then from that going forward, you can then determine if the micro front end is really the best solution for you. Okay. Thank you all so much for listening to my talk. And I also just want to say thank you to the organizers of React Miami for giving me a chance to speak at my very first conference. So thank you very much. And if you want to follow me, I don't tweet a lot, but I should definitely do a much better job. Oh, sorry, touched the mic. But you can follow me at the Danny Maxwell and at rotational.io. We actually do kind of blog at our website at Rotational Labs. And I actually am planning on posting some blog posts about micro frontends going forward. So again, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your time here in Miami. Bye.